The road to the Civil War leads to discussions of states' rights, to slavery, and differing economic systems, specifically whether those economic systems should involve slavery, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, specifically how his election impacted slavery, but none of those things would have been issues without slavery. So let's pick up with the most controversial section of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, longtime Crash Course viewers will remember that there was already a fugitive slave law written into the United States Constitution. So what made this one so controversial? Under this new law, any citizen was required to turn in anyone he or she knew to be a slave to authorities, and that made like every person in New England into a sheriff, and it also required them to enforce a law they found abhorrent. Railroads made shipping cheaper and more efficient and allowed people to move around the country quickly, and they had a huge backer, also a tiny backer, in the form of Illinois Congressman Stephen Douglas, who wanted a transcontinental railroad because, one, he felt it would bind the Union together at a time when it could use some binding, and two, he figured it would go through Illinois, which would be good for his home state. But there was a problem. To build a railroad, the territory through which it ran needed to be organized, ideally as states, and if the railroad was going to run through Illinois, then the Kansas and Nebraska territories would need to become state-like, so Douglas pushed forward the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act formalized the idea of popular sovereignty, which basically meant that white residents of states could decide for themselves whether the state should allow slavery. Douglas felt this was a nice way of avoiding saying whether he favored slavery. Instead, he could just be in favor of letting other people be in favor of it. Now, you'll remember that the previously bartered Missouri Compromise banned slavery in new states north of this here line. And since in theory Kansas or Nebraska could have slavery if people there decided they wanted it under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, despite being north of that there line, this in practice repealed the Missouri Compromise. As a result, there was quite a lot of violence in Kansas, so much so that some people say the Civil War really started there in 1857. Also, the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to the creation of a new political party. The Republicans. Yes, those Republicans. For many Northerners, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise, was yet more evidence that Congress was controlled by a sinister slave power group doing the bidding of rich plantation owners, which, as conspiracy theories go, wasn't the most far-fetched. In fact, by 1854, the North was far more populous than the South. It had almost doubled the South's congressional representation, but in spite of this advantage, Congress had just passed a law extending the power of slave states, and potentially, because 2 new states meant 4 new senators, making the federal government even more pro-slavery. And to abolitionists, that didn't really seem like democracy. The other reason that many Northerners cared enough about Kansas and Nebraska to abandon their old party loyalties was that having them become slave states was seen as a threat to Northerners' economic self-interest. Anyway, in the end, Kansas passed 2 constitutions because, that's a good way to get started as a government. The pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution was the first that went to the U.S. Congress, and it was supported by Stephen Douglas as an example of popular sovereignty at work, except that the man who oversaw the voting in Kansas called it a vile fraud. Congress delayed Kansas's entry into the Union, because Congress's primary business is delay, until another more fair referendum took place, and after that vote, Kansas eventually did join the U.S. as a free state in 1861, by which time it was frankly too late. Alright, so while all this craziness was going on in Kansas and Congress, the Supreme Court was busy rendering the worst decision in its history. Oh, hi there, Dred Scott. Dred Scott had been a slave whose master had taken him to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both of which barred slavery, so Scott sued, arguing that if slavery was illegal in Illinois, then living in Illinois made him definitionally not a slave. The case took years to find its way to the Supreme Court, and eventually in 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from Maryland handed down his decision. The court held that Scott was still a slave, but it went even further, attempting to settle the slavery issue once and for all. I mean, Taney's ruling basically said that all black people anywhere in the United States could be considered property, and that the court was in the business of protecting that property. This meant that a slave owner could take his slaves from Mississippi to Massachusetts and they would still be slaves, which meant that technically there was no such thing as a free state. At least that's how people in the North, especially Republicans, saw it. The Dred Scott decision helped convince even more people that the entire government, Congress, President Buchanan, and now the Supreme Court were in the hands of the dreaded slave power. power. In 1859, John Brown led a disastrous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to capture guns and then give them to slaves who would rise up and use those guns against their master. In 1860, the Republican Party chose as its candidate Abraham Lincoln, whose hair and upper forehead you can see here. He'd proved his eloquence, if not his electability, in a series of debates with Stephen Douglas when the two were running for the Senate in 1858. Lincoln lost that election, but the debates made him famous, and he could appeal to immigrant voters because he wasn't associated with the know-nothings. The Democrats, on the other hand, were, to use a historian term, a hot mess. The northern wing of the party favored Stephen Douglas, but he was unacceptable to voters in the Deep South, so Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, making the Democrats the last remaining truly national party, no longer truly a national party. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, dedicated to preserving the Constitution, quote, as it is, i.e. including slavery, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln received 0 votes in 9 American states, but he won 40% of the overall popular vote, including majorities in many of the most populous states, thereby winning the Electoral College. So anytime a guy becomes president who literally did not appear on your ballot, there is likely to be a problem. And indeed, Lincoln's election led to a number of southern states seceding from the Union. Lincoln himself hated slavery, but he repeatedly said that he would leave it alone in the states where it existed. But the demographics of Lincoln's election showed Southerners and Northerners alike that slave power, to whatever extent it had existed, was over. By the time he took office on March 1st, 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, and the stage was set for the fighting to begin, which it did when Southern troops fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861.